Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of chapter 17, talking about the Renaissance and the Baroque period, and we are still talking about the High Renaissance. And here is one of the most recognizable statues that come from the High Renaissance, the statue of David by Michelangelo. What we spoke about earlier in terms of the Renaissance, these ideas of rebirth, this rediscovery in terms of science and the arts, and we are looking at example of the amount of time and study that was put into rendering the human form. It is very accurate in terms of capturing representationalism. And this work here, very tall sculpture, 14 feet, made from marble, 1501 to 1504. It took 3 years to finish. This is claimed to be one of the most powerful depictions of David as a hero, the defender of just cause. You'll notice that he is standing in the contrapposto pose. If you think about David, you'll see him a lot in terms of Christian arts. Maybe you remember the work done by Donatello earlier, and that he was portrayed differently. He looked younger. He had a hat. He was a little bit more decorative, but here he is portrayed a little bit older. His pose looks different as well. You'll notice that his slingshot is on his shoulder, as though he was about to engage in the battle against Goliath. Very different from the way Donatello portrayed him, in that he was already standing on Goliath's armor. So that is a depiction of David after the battle with Goliath, and this is more about the tension, the awareness of before the battle. Another famous work by Michelangelo is the Sistine Chapel painting. Many images from Genesis. The creation of Adam is probably the most recognized work, and you can see that in this painting here, the upper center image. And here is a more detailed shot of the creation of Adam. Something about Michelangelo, he often did not like being called a painter, because he felt that being a sculptor was a higher form of art. And if you look at his sculpture, his paintings, they look like sculptures in terms of the way they are rendered. They feel very much formed in terms of mass. And so we have a lot of depiction of shadows. Here's another painting that came from the High Renaissance, but this is not by Michelangelo. This is actually by Raphael. So when it comes to the Renaissance, one of the things to look for is whether or not there's somewhat of a Christian theme involved. In this one, there is somewhat, especially because of the figure has a halo above his head, but at the same time there's this portrayal of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, especially from their clothing. You can also tell from the sculpture in the background on the right side. It looks like an ancient Roman sculpture, ancient Roman architecture. So when it comes to the Renaissance, especially during the High Renaissance, you see a lot of this hybridization that's going on in terms of their composition. It may be Christian, but also Neoplatonist. And this is again by Raphael, Paul preaching at Athens, 1515. A very strong composition using different angles of perspective. The central figures are of Plato and Aristotle, a commission by Pope Leo X. Very large painting, 11 feet by 14 feet. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about the Renaissance in Northern Europe, slightly different from the Renaissance in Italy. When it came to these works from Northern Europe, there was a preoccupation with depicting life in the real world. And how does that differ from what we just looked at? Well, if you think about the Renaissance, they are portraying things like religion or Neoplatonism, while the Renaissance in Northern Europe was different in that they were trying to portray the real world, or just regular life. One of the most famous artists that came from that period is Jan van Eyck of Flanders. And here is one of his most famous paintings. So when it comes to the Renaissance in general, you can say that characteristics would include high quality of rendering, especially when it came to the human form. High quality of rendering in terms of light and shadow and of the fabric. And if you look at this overall composition here, some interesting things happening with the dog in the very bottom. You'll see the woman wearing a green dress and that her hand is over her abdomen as though she is about to give birth. Something about the dog and the puppy and the green dress, they are symbols of fertility. So you can probably say maybe this was painted before the woman was actually pregnant and with hopes that she would become pregnant. You'll notice on the floor there are shoes that are removed or slippers that are removed because back then you were not allowed to wear shoes on a sacred place. So their sacred area here is the room, the bedroom. You'll see oranges. Those also are signs of fertility. There is an open window. Light coming from the upper left-hand corner is something that you'll see a lot of in Christian works. You'll notice that the chandelier above the couple has one candle that is lit. And that one candle that is lit symbolizes the Holy Spirit. Under the chandelier, we have a mirror, and that the mirror actually has a reflection of the couple and also the artist, and we can't really see it from this perspective, but on that mirror you'll see 12 knobs, 12 indentions around the mirror, and each of these shapes have an image or a scene from the Passion. So the images of the crucifixion of Christ. Above the mirror is Jan van Eyck's name. Jan van Eyck was here. So a lot of really interesting symbology is happening in this work. Something about painters from the Netherlands and the Northern European area, they are the ones that perfected oil paint to what it is in today's standards. So many interesting symbologies of fertility, fidelity, and their faith. Also from the Northern European Renaissance, Albrecht Dürer. And this is actually a different type of work. It's not a painting, The Night, Death, and the Devil. And this is an etching. If you can recall one of the chapters about printmaking, the method in which the artist uses a little bit of the nitric acid to produce lines, this is an example of that method, that printmaking method. Very highly detailed. And so when it came to these works of art from Northern Europe, again, they are not really capturing the divine as much as they did in Italy. Instead, you have these more everyday scenes. So we just looked at the wedding couple, even though that has a lot of religious themes. This one, on the other hand, is more mundane, more everyday. And we have a scene of men hunting. A very nice portrayal of this perspective happening to create depth. And again, from the Renaissance, even in Northern Europe, such a high progression when it comes to capturing form. And these everyday paintings are referred to as genre paintings. So genre paintings are the lives and surroundings of common people. Sometimes they are portrayed with these rich landscapes. And this is Peter Bruegel, Hunters in the Snow, 1565. And so here is another work of art. Actually, we are somewhere in between the Renaissance, the High Renaissance, and the Northern Europe Renaissance, in that this is a portrayal of Jesus in the center, lower center, but it's not exactly the image that some of us might be already thinking about. Does it look like the Last Supper to you? Well, actually, this is a variation of that. And so this painter here was actually commissioned to do a painting of the Last Supper, but the artist went out of his way to make it a little bit more telling of the time. He tried to incorporate images of the everyday people. And this is by Paolo Veronese, Feast in the House of Levi. So when this painting was completed, it was actually looked at in a very negative way. And so we have this portrayal of the Last Supper. We expect to see the 12 apostles, and instead we see everyday people. It was led to accusations of heresy by the Inquisition. So maybe some of you have heard of that time. Inquisition, basically a time period when they were trying to persecute those who were turning away from the church. So Veronese, he went out of his way to produce a work of art like this. It was looked at as an important trial for artistic freedom at the time. And that the artist felt like he should be free to interpret the subject the way he wants to. And of course, back then, that was a big no-no. You're not supposed to portray Christ in this particular way. We don't want to see him in that particular way. We like to always see him in a more traditional way that somehow incorporates ancient Roman style, things like that. And so we're finally shifting over to a different subject here. We are going to talk about the Baroque period. The Baroque is actually one of my favorite art periods, and you're about to see why. This was around the year 1600 to 1750. When it came to this style, art moved in the direction of drama, emotion, and splendor. They set aside balanced harmony of the Renaissance artists in favor of innovative use of space. And what is being meant by that is, if you could think about the paintings during the Renaissance or during the early Renaissance or the High Renaissance, you could say that many of the paintings were fairly balanced. It's very colorful, very much clarity in terms of what we look for when it comes to capturing form. The fabric is very highly rendered in its accuracy. And so during the Baroque, they put these types of compositions behind. They try to move away from the typical style. And the Baroque was actually inspired by this counter-reformation of the Roman Catholic Church. So you can look at it as a way for the church to bring people back into Catholicism. You can say that during the Renaissance, if you think about the medieval time, how people were basically living their life in a very strict religious way, and they tried to move away from that during this period of humanism. And so this counter-reformation was this idea to bring interest back into the church. And the most popular artist that came from the Baroque period is Caravaggio. And he would do things like this in his compositions. He would use directed light and strong contrast. So very strong contrast, very strong darks and very strong lights. Use of chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro meaning light and dark in Italian. He also does what is called foreshortening and sharp diagonals. Foreshortening is when you paint a shape or a figure in that part of it is zoomed in towards the viewer. So if you can imagine, if you were to take a picture of yourself, and if you were to put your hand in front of your camera, that camera would look very big, right? And the rest of your body would be behind it. It would somehow look smaller than your hand that's right in front of the camera. So foreshortening is a way to portray shape or human form in a different diagonal that is a little bit more exaggerated, a little bit more dramatic, and it's probably easier to describe when we look at it. So keep foreshortening in mind. These are things that I will be asking you about when it comes to defining the Baroque period. And here we have one of Caravaggio's most famous works. He has actually very many. I'm not just saying that because he's one of my favorite artists, but they all look very similar to this. And so when it comes to the Baroque period, this idea of moving away from the traditional Renaissance style, this Renaissance type of clarity, instead the Baroque was more about drama. So the darks were very dark, the lights were very light. It seems like a light was shown just from one particular angle, and so that would exaggerate the shadows. And so what we mean by foreshortening is, if you were to look at the figure that is lying down, so this painting is called the Conversion of St. Paul, and that the idea or the story behind him, if you are familiar, was that he used to be a Assyrian general, and that he was one day riding on his horse and a bright light shined on him and he fell down and he heard a voice telling him, why are you persecuting me? And so him being an Assyrian general did not believe in God, and so when he was blinded by this light and he fell down and he heard this voice, he was actually unable to get up for a couple days, and that when he was finally able to get up, he was convinced that God exists and that he felt like it was his life mission to to live out his plan, to live out God's plan. Okay, and sorry if I if I told that story, if I messed it up, forgive me for that. Um, so this is the saint. This is the conversion of Saint Paul. We are looking at some foreshortening happening with the figure. His head is towards us, and that his body is rendered partially. We can't see, everything. We can't see his his feet to the very end, so it's a little bit more exaggerated than a normally depicted figure. So a lot of interesting angles, a lot of foreshortening, a lot of strong contrast. That's what the Baroque period was all about. And so this is, again, by Caravaggio, made around the 1600s. So the Baroque period, you'll see a lot of pretty dark compositions, but balanced by very strong highlights. And here is another Baroque painting, but not by the same artist. Instead, it was an artist very much inspired by Caravaggio. And this is Gentileschi. Gentileschi is actually one of the few famous female artists of the time. And this is a painting called Judith beheading the general Holofernes. And so again, when it comes to the Baroque period, a lot of exaggerated darks and lights, more emotion being portrayed in comparison to what we've seen during the Renaissance. And so this piece here, very famous scene from the Old Testament. Okay, so I believe one of the questions in the quiz or the exam is, who is the artist that was inspired by Caravaggio? I'm hoping you remember this artist here, Gentileschi. Another famous work that came from the Baroque period is a sculptor. When it comes to the Baroque period in general, a little bit more emotion. And so we are looking at a sculpture called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And so we are looking at the sculpture here, and that it is highly rendered in terms of the form, the fabric, and in terms of the composition. Look at the interesting arrangement of diagonal lines coming from the ceiling. And so maybe some of you have heard of her before. This Saint Teresa, I believe Saint Teresa of Avila. She's one of the earliest nuns. If not, she might be the first nun. And so I'm trying to remember all of these. I'm trying to remember all of these stories now. And so when it comes to Saint Teresa, she had an experience, a very divine experience, where she was in a dream state. She was asleep, and that she dreamt of an angel standing over her body, and that she remembers the angel holding an arrow, and that the arrow had fire on it, and that the angel was pointing the arrow at her heart, and that as he pointed the arrow at her heart, she felt a very strong connection, or what can be described as a very high or a very strong feeling of ecstasy. You could say that it is a happiness beyond normal, and that she felt like that is all she needed in her life, was this this blessing from God and nothing else. And so this work here, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, is basically a reenactment of what she described as her experience with the divine. So Bernini is one of the most famous sculptors from the Baroque period, and when it comes to this style again, portrayal of intense emotion, and look at the facial expression by Saint Teresa, you can in a way tell that she is in a different state of mind. The St. Peter's Baldacchino was also made by Bernini. If some of you have been, if you, let's say, okay, so right now I am filming this during the COVID era. And so something that me and my family saw, we were watching Mass on television with the Pope, and that he was on TV, he was giving his Mass here at the St. Peter's Basilica, and I was able to see this on the video, so it was actually pretty neat to see that. So when it comes to this artwork that came from the Baroque period, you could say that it's very stylized, it is very exaggerated, it is very intense. It was a way to get people interested in the church again. Another artist that came from the Baroque period, Peter Paul Rubens, and you can see a lot of foreshortening being rendered here, especially with the central figure. All we see is his right shoulder, his back, and look at those, look at the muscles on these figures. And that's something that was exaggerated during the Baroque period, even though we saw a lot of that in ancient Rome, and even during the Renaissance, with the nude subject being very popular. In the Baroque period, they exaggerated all of that. A lot of really dramatic foreshortening. The Raising of the Cross, 1610. You can tell it is of the Baroque period because of the exaggerated darks and lights, and also the diagonals. And here we are looking at another famous work from the Baroque period, except that this is from a different artist, actually from a Spanish artist. And this work is called Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. One of the most controversial paintings to ever be discussed, and the reason behind that is, if you look at the portrayal of space, it's very ambiguous. So we are looking at the princess in the center. She is accompanied by her helpers, her chef, her entourage. We have the head of the servants behind him in the doorway, a very interesting figure as well. Behind the princess is a photo or a painting of her parents, when it looks somewhat illuminated, so people are wondering if that is supposed to be a mirror. And if you see the figure on the left, that's actually the artist himself. He painted himself in this painting. And if you look at other things in terms of the composition, if you look at the way the wall is being portrayed, it seems like that wall behind the princess is supposed to be far away from us, but it doesn't exactly feel like that because of the light in that is piercing through the doorway. That in a way stops us from believing that there's so much depth in this room. And so there's some really interesting things. There's a dwarf. If you look at the figure on the right, lower right corner, she's a dwarf. So the princess had a very interesting entourage. And you'll notice that this is not exactly related to the Counter Reformation. It feels a little bit more like a genre painting. And so this work was painted for Philip IV, King Philip, the King of Spain. Very large painting, 10 feet tall. Very tall painting. Okay, so another painting that came from the Baroque period, and you can probably guess it is from that era because of this composition, the exaggerated darks and lights. And this work is by Rembrandt, Return of the Prodigal Son, oil on canvas, 8 feet by 6 feet, so another large painting from the Baroque period. Another interesting thing that came out of this time as well is architecture, and this is the Palace of Versailles. And try to check out the video of this work because you can see how intricate the interior space became. They really focused on things like design during this time. And I'm going to go ahead and pause it here. This is the end of part 2. This is going to be a 3-part chapter. A pretty big chapter. So hang in there.